Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Elder Asapas. As Christy mentioned, I'm Zarka Nawaz, and I do host the morning edition, and I wanted to thank all the loyal listeners who have had to listen to me for the last 2 months. I know I'm not Sheila. Sheila did it for 24 years, and she has made this job almost an impossible possible shoes to fill. And I know that listening to me has been really an interesting experience, and I appreciate the emails that I have gotten in support from all of you. I have one on my board that I pinned that says, "She pronounces words very well." It was one of the things that really helped me get through, especially when I make a lot of mistakes on air. I don't know why, but I even type out the dates and everything in bold, and I will still say, "It's Tuesday. No, it's Thursday. It's March 8th. No," and then there's always that look of horror behind my people behind the glass who are just like, "Oh no, she's doing it again." Or poor David Blair, who is our business specialist, and I say, "David, time for the sports news." And you're like, "No, Zarka, I'm here to deliver the business news." But on a positive note, our sports guy actually likes to do movie reviews, it turns out, and is now talking to me about fulsome stories about how he doesn't believe Jurassic Park should be remade 10 times. So, so then I get the complaints that we eventually have to get to the sports. We can't continue having our sports guy do movie reviews. And the person that, Ted Deller, has been the person who sits beside me and supports me during the last 2 months. And my children have said to me, "We have never appreciated Ted Deller more than now that we have someone to compare him to." And for whatever reason, I call Ted is like the easiest of the white names, right? Of all the white names out there, Ted should be the easiest. But for some reason, I call him Peter. I don't know why. I keep referring to him as Peter Deller. And but I pronounce Peter properly. But we do have a Peter Mills in the office. So now Ted is starting to ask me why it is that I refer to him as Peter. And I just wanted to say, I like, maybe it's the beard. Peter Mills has a big red beard. Muslim women and beards. I don't know. Maybe there's some sort of affinity. So I just wanted to say that I'm very sorry, Ted, for referring to you as Peter. But gradually, I'm hoping, as my 3rd month starts going, I will start to pronounce people's names. Maybe pronounce them right, but get them right. Get David Blair to actually say the business news and not sports. But it's been a rocky transition, and I wanted to thank you, listeners, for being patient with me and sending those supportive tweets and those supportive emails. I really, really appreciate it. It's been a nerve-wracking experience for me. But I couldn't have done it without all of you. So we are now going to start a live streaming event, and it's okay to use your cell phones for tweets and social media posts, but please don't use your flash, and kindly put your phone on silent mode. Penny has my phone, in fact. I think it's out there. Penny, would you be able to put it on silent mode wherever you are? I don't think I did that. And also, if you're going to post from tonight's event, we ask you to use the hashtag CBC Asks or hashtag Beyond94. Allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Marie Wilson. She is a former commissioner with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. She's been part of the process helping to draft the ideas and recommendations of thousands of residential school survivors to create the 94 calls to action. And since the formal work of the commission has come to a close, Marie has been all over the world talking to groups and governments about reconciliation. She's also recently been appointed to the board of directors of CBC. And tonight she is here for her expertise in reconciliation. Not as a CBC board member, we are honored to have you join us. And I was talking a little bit to Marie in the green room. She was one of the first female reporters of the Leader Post back in the day. That's how she began her career a while back, so it's almost come full circle.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Next, we have Chief Cadmus Delorme. He is the chief of the Cowessess First Nation, which is 170 kilometers east of Regina. He has been the leader of the First Nation for nearly 2 years. He's a graduate of First Nations University of Canada and holds a master's degree from Public Nations University of Canada and a master's degree of Public Administration from the Johnson Soyoma School of Public Policy at the University of Regina. Chief Delorme has also been named as one of CBC's future 40, and if his business acumen and leadership skills at such a young age aren't enough, he's an incredible golfer. In fact, he's been a champion amateur golfer in Saskatchewan. But what I wanted to say, if you listen to his TEDx talk, have you guys heard this? He was allergic to breast milk, and someone told his mother, well, he can drink goat milk, so his mom got a goat. And he was, I know, can you say breastfed by a goat? And you have a joke about that. Sometimes when you speak, you accidentally say it.
Well, my mom doesn't have a bald spot because she pushed it against a goat. And sometimes when I laugh, you kind of hear a little bah.
It's a great story. I mean, I wish I had known about the goat earlier when I had children. I could have passed a lot of breastfeeding on to the goat. Anyway. Our next panelist is James Dashuk. He's a history professor in the Kinesiology and Health Studies faculty at the University of Regina. While history and kinesiology might not seem to be a likely pairing, allow me to make sense of it this way. James teaches Indigenous studies to students who are going into health professions. He's also the author of a widely acclaimed book called Clearing the Plains, Disease and Politics of Starvation and the Loss of Aboriginal Life. Welcome, James.
Thank you.
He speaks a lot at high schools across the city, and my son, when I found out that you'd be on this panel, he was so impressed. He wanted me to tell you, you're a really smart guy. Finally, our fourth panelist is Shauna Uchu. She's a social justice activist. She's a mother and works tirelessly with people in Regina's North Central to make the city a better and safer place. Uchu is the executive director of the White Pony Lodge. It's a grassroots organization with the aim of ending violence. Thank you for joining us tonight, Shauna. Shauna's nickname growing up was Googles. And she, like me, also didn't know about the goat story, because that would have been really handy while we were raising our babies. Anyways, we've gathered these four people tonight to have a full and frank discussion about reconciliation. We're going to ask our panelists a few questions about this topic, but we also want to hear from you, the audience. We'd like to remind you that we have an open but respectful discussion tonight. We'd ask that you keep your questions or comments on the shorter side so we can get as many comments in as possible. We're also broadcasting live, so please refrain from booing, cheering, or making inappropriate comments. We also hope to wrap up this event by 8:30 tonight. For those of you who know, the morning edition starts at 6 a.m., and I have to be at work at 4 a.m., so I'm past my bedtime already. So we got to make sure that I get home on time tonight, you guys. I have enough trouble on the morning edition with enough sleep, so you can just imagine what would happen. There is a microphone in the aisle right there. If you have a question or a comment you'd like to make, we'll ask you to step up to the microphone. After we've posed a few questions to our panelists, we'll come to you in the audience for your questions and comments. We will ask you to introduce yourself, so don't be shy. Do step up to the microphone, but first give us a few minutes to get the thoughts of our four panelists on reconciliation. So my first question is to you, Marie. Is reconciliation possible?
Well, I think it's not only is it possible, it is unfolding. The very fact that we are here tonight and we are having this conversation, if we were to ask ourselves honestly, would we be having this conversation 10 years ago, even 5 years ago? I think we all know the answer. So I think the question only becomes one that causes us concern if we set ourselves up to believe there is a right answer to what reconciliation means and that there's only one answer. And what if we don't have it right yet? And what if everything isn't already towards being fixed? I think we were very clear when we wrote the report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and our calls to action that reconciliation is not a quick fix. It's not a flip of the switch kind of thing. It is not easy, and it is also complex. It's complex and complicated. But we were very intentional in directing our calls to action to a wide cross-section of society in the belief that there is work to be done by all of us in all sectors of our society. And so the trick is to keep trying what we're trying, to start trying where we're not yet trying, and to keep encouraging each other as we move forward.
Cadmus.
Good evening. I thank our knowledge keeper for the beautiful prayer and starting us off in the right way. It's happening. Reconciliation can't be done without uncomfortable conversations. And some of those uncomfortable conversations are starting to happen more and more. There was a little bit of what you call ignorance at one point, a little bit of just the past is the past kind of attitude, the blame game. But now we're starting to, as a society, get it. That something happened that we didn't create, but we inherited. And now we got 94 calls to action that it's up to us to own them, regardless of our background, and to walk forward together, shoulder to shoulder. We have such talented people in the province. We have such talented people in the country, and over 100,000 authors who went through the pain of residential school gave us 94 things to implement. And now people are the momentum's starting to build. And you have things like the Boucher case or the Fontaine case that just take a snapshot in time to say, okay, we really have to take these 94 calls to action a little more serious, because we can't do it with just silos. It has to be with no walls, no barriers. So it is happening, and I'm excited to be a part of just a little bit of that to allow it to build the momentum.
James?
Well, I think reconciliation is possible, but it's also incumbent upon all of us, because if we can't achieve that goal, and this is going to be a generational process, we're going to be doomed. And I teach health studies, so the way I think of this is, actually it was Minister Jane Philpott just in January said that Indigenous Canadians have a 15-year shorter life expectancy than the rest of us. So that's almost the quantifiable measure of how far we've got to go. And that's not going to change overnight. And really, in my research, Cadmus just mentioned, the court case was like a photo. My work as a historian is to make the movie. And really, our Indigenous people in Saskatchewan and Canada and the rest of us, our societies have been going on different trajectories almost since the time of the treaties. And in a lot of ways, we don't understand each other. So we have to get together, we have to meet each other, we have to start speaking to each other. And as Cadmus said, we got to have those difficult conversations.
Shauna?
I also believe that reconciliation is possible. And before I supply my answer, I just want to acknowledge our elder for lifting prayers for us. But not only that, acknowledge that we are on Treaty 4 territory, homeland of the Cree, Soto, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota, and homelands of the Métis. So in regards to reconciliation, I really believe that it is possible, but it's going to take all levels of government, but also individuals within the community to really make it work. Will we achieve it in my lifetime? I don't believe so. I think that we still need to look at the truth part of it and really not romanticize reconciliation. Although that's a goal that we want to achieve, we can't jump over the truth part of the truth and reconciliation. So it's a very important aspect, but I really believe that today there are many things that are being done within our communities, within organizations that are really kind of can work towards it, and it is achievable for sure.
Thank you very much. Audience, does anyone have a question and would like to come to our microphone? We're waiting to hear from you.
I do, but it's not a question, it's more of an opinion. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And if you can give me your name when you begin.
My name is Brady Brown. I have cards here. I'm trying not to take up as much time as I can here. I'd like to thank our elder for the prayer. And when it comes to reconciliation, I'd like to ask who measures it, right? Like, who measures reconciliation? And for the past 250 years, First Nations people have been treated poorly, I'd say. And in this very popular trend, if you will. Let's see, what kind of things could change the quality of life for First Nations people? Self-government is a topic that I could bring up. Property tax, 50% off shoreside property tax. as more of like an acknowledgement, to the true land ownership. And I don't think, and I think the government has been avoiding that issue for so long and using the term financial pain as an excuse, and I don't think that should be an excuse for doing the right thing. But anyways, that's one card. How can there be reconciliation? Well, I want to know if there's a fact or a point, but was there any conciliation to begin with? How can you have reconciliation? And no offense to CBC, but like other mainstream news media, they still won't call it genocide or cultural genocide, and still want to attribute it to a source, right? So that's one point. I think there is a need for First Nations citizens and Canadian European citizens to work together economically for the country, right? So yeah, that's one point. Reconciliation is, I'd say, recolonization. Just no offense to CBC again, but the word reconciliation I keep seeing and I keep hearing is coming from these Canadian institutions, right, coming down. And I've never seen it actually been brought up by a First Nations band previous in a mainstream light. And I guess that's why we're here asking, is it possible? I feel like Canadian European citizens are allowed to hold onto their attitudes and mentality and do not challenge their behavior towards First Nations people or the land. Like I said, one card. This is my final card, so just so you know, I'm going to wrap this up. I'd like to point out there might be a need for self-government and to dissolve AFN. Maybe for the first decade, AFN went gun-ho, but and kept a progressive ideal. But now I see leaders with their own agendas, and they're becoming dependent on the government. First Nations' fundamental right to self-determination is one of many issues I see AFN cannot and will not address at the negotiation table because they are dependent on government money. And last card. One is left to wonder how conditioned some are to dependency and paternalism. For example, Canada knows what's best for us, Canada will take care of us. And I'd just like to end it there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So those were, I think, about 12 questions. This could be our entire evening. Is there any particular question that one of our panelists would like to answer?
Well, I would like to say a word about reconciliation, if I may, because it's core to the conversation tonight. And why are we having this conversation? And I think it's very, very important as we go forward that we not lose track of who are the heroes of this story. We are having this conversation in our country because of Indigenous people who are survivors of the residential schools. And the word reconciliation, for our gentleman there, and thank you for your many comments, it came from their court case against the government and the churches who ran the residential schools where they spent their childhoods. And we as commissioners inherited the wording we were given in the settlement that came out of that massive court case. This was not a government-initiated commission. It was a survivor-advocated commission. And the terms of our mandate were negotiated as part of a massive out-of-court settlement, the largest in our history as a country. So we can spend a lot of time and energy, I think, debating words. But I think the mistake we would make is to lose the spirit of those words as they were intended, as they were given to us. And there is no word in any language that's going to perfectly cover all that we mean, so we need to constantly repeat what it is we mean when we use certain words. And what it said in our mandate was that reconciliation, it's not a thing, it's not a word that means the opposite of conciliation. It says it's an ongoing process that involves individuals and collectives, that involves residential school survivors and their families, people who ran the schools and their descendants, the governments, the churches, and the people of Canada. So all of us. That's what it says about reconciliation, that it is ongoing. Unlike the commission itself, which had a term, reconciliation is ongoing. And it talks about what the point of it is. It says the point of it is that in sharing our truths, and you spoke well about the importance of truth, Shauna, that in sharing our truths, that it will contribute to the healing of peoples, will help with the freeing up of spirits, and will lead to the reconciliation of relationships. I'm paraphrasing that part of it. So, but the intent is a spiritual one, really, that it will restore relationships in a way that is healing for people and for both individuals and collectives, and that things can be in a new way. So I salute the heroes who are the residential school survivors, whose courage and whose incredible bravery in sharing their experiences, which have taught us as a country and have brought us to this place of national conversation, that we honor the importance of that and not get hung up on whether we think the word should have meant this or should have been something else.
Shauna, would you like to say something?
I think in regards to your question, when it comes to self-governance and in answering that, White Pony Lodge has been a community initiative, and our vision of the organization is to cultivate a proud and inclusive community guided by the spirit and intent of the spirit of truth and reconciliation. And we do that by providing partnerships, programs, and services. And really, for us as a community, it was our responsibility. We felt it was our responsibility to address a lot of the issues that were occurring within our community, like violence and poverty and, all of these things, even the stereotypical labels that had been placed upon us. And really was to kind of bring awareness around, really, like, we have a lot of Indigenous community members who attended Indian residential school who are dealing with a lot of the intergenerational trauma and the effects of residential school, and there was not enough information in regards to that, right? And helping the wider community understand that. So we really took it upon ourselves to create an organization that would address those issues and those concerns, but also to inform and educate others and be kind of, I always say that, a beacon of light, like these are the issues and this is where we need the help.
James?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with you about the reconciliation often coming kind of from the white guys or from the establishment. Often what I found is, in my experience, well-meaning people are like, well, could First Nations people just forgive us for what we've done, and then we can move on? But of course, I'm reminded of one of the chiefs. The Governor General of Canada traveled west during the famine in 1880, and he met some of the chiefs just after the Treaty 6 was signed. And one of the chiefs told the Governor General, we can't eat words, we need help, it can't just be talk. So from my perspective, there are measurable things that you can do. I spoke about diminishing the gap in life expectancy, but we know that there's a gap, a 30% gap in funding for First Nations kids on reserve schools compared to provincial schools. We know that there's overrepresentation in the jails. Those are the ways, by diminishing those differences between the two parts of society, that's how from my perspective, that's how we're going to measure whether we're progressing or not. And that's not going to change overnight, because what it's really going to require is it's going to require a change in the power. There was just, I think it was just 2 years ago, Maclean's.ca, the online Maclean's magazine, talked about how white power was centered in Saskatchewan, and it was actually quite shocking. There were 0 mayors and very few councillors and stuff like that. The Indigenous proportion of Saskatchewan is something like 25%. So we've got to shift that power over to represent the true proportional representation of our province. And we haven't really done that yet. And what it's going to take is it's going to take a shifting of power. It's going to take a shifting of economics, of wealth. And maybe that's starting, but it's going to take a while.
Cadmus?
I counted 11 questions in here, 4 cards. So, no, thank you. Number one is, just having that confidence to stand up and just share. That's very powerful. In James Dashtek's book, I'm a big fan of James. I'm always extra happy when he sits beside me.
I owe you $1.
Okay. In 1850, surveyors come across Treaty 4 territory. It wasn't even Treaty 4 yet. They come across 3 of my ancestors, and they were from Cowses. And they were amongst the most fittest, mentally, physically, emotionally. These surveyors documented that these Indigenous people were just so together, so funny, so fit. And and I just close my eyes and I think, what was so strong about my ancestors? And I just think of how they just collectively had it together, and humor was just a part of it. And now you take a snapshot in 2018, we're amongst sometimes the most unfittest. We have a lot of re-identifying, rediscovering to go. So to answer your first question about who's adding up the score, I hate to say it like that, but that's kind of how I got it, is who's measuring, is I will not stop talking and pushing this until I can say that we are, again, the most fittest people and doing our part. When you talk about the TRC, there's words in Cree that were spoken at that treaty that we must now bring back in. Wetaskiwin, all of us in Treaty 4 are sharing this land. Regardless of our viewpoint on TRC, regardless on our viewpoint of what role we play, of what skin color we are, where our home fire is, we all share this land together, Wetaskiwin, and we have to work with that. Right now, certain people are afraid to travel because of the Bushi case that just happened. That's the reality of some Indigenous people in Treaty 4. It's a very uncomfortable thing to talk about, but that's a reality. But you talk about the AFN, you talk about governance. Governance starts with righteousness in each of our hearts. It doesn't start at the AFN. It starts with our own internal governance. We're our own worst enemy, we're our own best friend. And the view we have of ourselves and what we're doing, that's governance. That's where it starts, is with ourself. And after ourself, then we look at our homes. Are our home fires a nice harmony place? Because that's governance in its own means. And then after that, where do we belong to? Do we belong to the city? Do we belong to a First Nation? Do we belong to a municipality? How is our governance there? And then we belong to Saskatchewan as a province. Then we belong to a country called Canada. We can't just go right to the top of, say, AFN or federal government and just start saying, they don't speak for me. They things that they're doing. It doesn't start there. It starts in here. And as a chief, as a chief of 4,255 people, some of them in this room, we are collectively rediscovering and re-identifying ourselves. And as the chief, I will always make sure that we internally get our stuff together, because I call upon the FSIN and the AFN to help in areas that I can't do as a chief. Because I'm a mayor, I'm a premier, I'm a prime minister, I'm a business person, I manage poverty. There's so many roles I play as a chief. And when I hear people critique FSIN, critique an AFN, it's tough being a chief in this country. There's so much expectations of what a chief does. And so, I just want to conclude that it just starts with ourselves. And, what's our image that we're going to play? And let's play it hard. Perry has a tough job Perry Bellegarde, critiqued so much. I'm not advocating for him. Bobby Cameron, tough job, but someone has to do it. Those are governance. They're definitely dependent on federal funding, on provincial federal funding. But they're advocates for all the 74 chiefs in this province, and I'm pleased with what, some of the things they're doing for causes. There's some things I don't agree with, but I will tell them and call them myself. I will hear your opinion, I'll call them and tell them that. And that's what phones and technology is for. So just some of my comments, but thank you.
We'd like to hear from our audience. Would someone like to be brave and come to our microphone? This is a wonderful panel. This is a wonderful chance to ask your question, please. And your name, please.
I'm Chastity Delorme, and proud Future 40 alumni. So I'm proud to be and honored to be invited to this event tonight. So I do have a couple of questions, if that's okay. But first, I wanted to acknowledge the definition of reconciliation, because I really think it's important moving forward that that we understand the actual definition of it, and part of it is making the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. So that's a huge statement when you consider Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities, when you consider grassroots organizations and crown corporations. So when you put a grassroots organization with and a crown corporation, and you try to mesh their views, that's where a lot of barriers start happening. And if you were to go to a crown corporation and dismantle or dissect their structures or policies, they're a lot different than what we would see in a grassroots organization. So we have this word of being compatible and making each other come to one belief. So is that part even possible? And I'd like to believe that it is, but there's so many different frame of minds, different types of educators, different types of grassroots people. So when you dissect that word, that really has to be taken into consideration, I believe. So I'd like to hear your opinions on that, that perspective. And the questions that I have are, do you feel that the oppressive structures and policies will restrain reconciliation moving forward? Because personally, I feel that it is these structures and policies that are going to prevent actual reconciliation in our grassroots organizations and mostly in our crown organizations. And my other question are, I believe myself, I am a bridge builder in my community, so I believe that I am a liaison between non-Indigenous communities and our Indigenous communities. And so being able to understand each other's languages. And so how important are allies? How important to you is the role of allies in reconciliation? And maybe one idea that you can share with the rest of us and the public of how we can support our allies, because I am a supporter of allies. I take great passion in educating allies and how we could move forward. And I always come from, allow us to teach about our oppression before you come in and assume that you know what we need. But at the same time, I support our allies because we need them in moving forward to reconciliation. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. How do we support our allies? Who would like to take that on? Shauna?
Well, I guess everyone's looking at me, so. First of all, I just want to acknowledge Chastity Delorme for her wonderful work within the community. She's an awesome advocate for Indigenous issues all around, so I just want to acknowledge that. First of all, I think when it comes to being a grassroots organization and really kind of spearheading and taking on a greater role and responsibility with truth and reconciliation, it first needs to be acknowledged that it's a huge undertaking and task, even just for the organization that White Pony Lodge is. It's a huge undertaking and task, and it takes an entire community to really build and to support it. And I think that's really where a lot of the success has come from. The city of Regina, take for example, is working towards creating a Reconciliation Regina organization, and honestly, I think, and truthfully speaking, it's tough, especially being a grassroots organization kind of working towards the same thing, because in the end, what this organization is going to be is it's going to become a nonprofit after 4 years, which it'll be funded for the duration of the funding will run out after 4 years. We're going to be kind of like competing for the same funds, right? But at the same time, we have to really look towards, what can we do today to really make to make White Pony Lodge something sustainable. So, for a long period of time. So I think that's kind of really where we're at with it right now. And then I'm sorry for the second question, the allies question. And this is just taking from Pam Palmater, who said, for allies, what do you have to offer that can really support reconciliation? I see Denise Repsky, she's a teacher and she's a huge supporter of reconciliation. She's sitting out here in the crowd today, and she's really saying, I have a classroom full of students that I can educate I can educate, but not only that, I have access to teachers that I can also educate. So really, our allies, when we're talking about reconciliation, it's really saying, what can I bring to the table? What do I have to offer? So I'm a really big proponent of that, but also understanding that, what are those things in the past that really oppressed Indigenous people in our communities, right? And looking at that as well, and making sure that we are aware of what those issues and those concerns are, so we're not repeating those mistakes. So,
James?
Yeah, I guess I'll be representing the white people in the panel. One of the things, and I'd just like to recognize Chastity. She's one of my former students. Good to see you. And thanks again for your question. One of the things is, I guess, just talking about allies, I don't know if I actually identify myself as a capital A ally, but as a citizen, I've had the privilege to have had a stable, supportive family, unlike a lot of people who had their families torn apart. And I had the opportunity to go to university and study. Excuse me. So after 22 years of university, I had the liberty and the privilege to do that. And so the state, Canada, supported my education. So I feel it incumbent upon me as a professor to contribute back to the community. And that's not just for the Indigenous people, that's for all of us. And I've given, I don't know how many talks I've given in the last few years, quite a few. And when the brown faces in the audience, when I'm speaking about the oppression and I'm speaking about the treaties being broken, the brown faces are nodding, yeah, we know, that's our story. But really, what I find the audience is the white faces. They're shocked because they haven't heard that story of oppression. We're under the, Canadians think we're the nicest people ever, right? Like two people bump into each other, they both say sorry. But sadly, there's a limit to that niceness. Like it doesn't convey to everyone in society. So by telling those stories and by having my privilege as a white scholar, as a white male scholar, I have the impression of impartiality. So when people hear that story, they would respond to it very differently than, say, if Cadmus wrote exactly the same words. And that's been a big lesson for me, because what that means is that like our voices reach a different audience, and that points to really like the racism that's so inherent in society that if we spoke the same words, there would be a different response. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us as citizens, the 100% of us, to start talking and really to start listening and to start learning.
Would you like to say something, Kevin?
Thank you, Chastity. You just always confirm we're such good-looking people from Cowses. Yeah. You know, you take the wampum belt story, you talk about allies, and you talk about what Indigenous people have been through in the last 140 years. And so you take the two canoes, and the goal was to canoe down the river together. Touch this pen, Chief Kawasas, and we'll row down this river together. And as soon as we touched that pen, they overflowed our canoe with water. And then they shook our canoe for 70 years trying to get us to tip. And my kokums and mushums, my grandmas and grandpas, stood firm in that canoe. And they went through a lot, mentally, emotionally. And now today, the generation now has an opportunity to change that canoe relationship. But the thing that we sometimes have to start talking about, which is another tough conversation, is we both sides, both canoes, have to change our view to what happened. We have to start looking at ourselves and saying, okay, we've been through a lot, but let's not intergenerational trauma still continue to pretend like that canoe is still being shook and water still being put into it. We have a trust issue now. We have a Liberal government that's trying to reconcile. And we got people right now not trusting anything that they want to bring to us, because we had a father named Pierre that tried to do the total opposite. So we're scratching our heads saying, what the heck's going on? We had a Conservative Prime Minister that was just trying to implement the white paper in many different ways. And so there's a trust issue, an image. That's where Allies has to start, is we have to change our viewpoint, not just on the Indigenous perspective, even the non-Indigenous perspective. But how it's going to happen is, instead of just giving papers and saying from the Crown Relations, this is consultation, do you accept this? No, it's going to take like Play-Doh, like mold. I'm going to have to mold it as Cowes' chief and hand it over to the government of Canada. They mold it and they hand it back to me, and I mold it and then I hand it back to them. We're not doing that. All we're doing is, here's option A, here's combo B, here's combo C. What do you think? And I turn around and try and consult with my own citizens, and they're like, don't trust anything, Chief. Well, where does it start? We all have to start changing the viewpoint of how we're looking at it. That's where it's going to start with Allies. And you know, the last thing that Chastity, her first question, I kind of took it as, you know, how do we view, you know, faith, or how do we view, you know, the way that we kind of view ourselves. What role do we play, kind of thing, is, you know, we just have to strive for excellence, strive for greatness. And you can't really measure that. It's just every day you wake up, I look at my elders, and, you know, if they look at me with extra pride in their eyes, I know I'm doing right. You know, when I see a little kid, I'll fist pump him and I'll ask him, who are you? I think I'm First Nations. No, who are you? I don't know. Are you Dakota? Are you Nakota? Tell me you're Dakota. I'm Dakota. Say it proud. I'm Dakota. I smile at them. That's who you are. I tell them. That's how we must take it forward. So just a couple comments.
Thank you. Marie, do you have anything to add?
I find myself thinking about the question that we asked across the country during the Commission's work, and it was to ask many different nations in Indigenous language, how would you translate in your language the concept of reconciliation? What would that be in your language? And Wetaskiwin was one of the terms that was offered by one of the elders. Where I come from in the Northwest Territories, and one of my Dene friends said, you know, the notion would be something like reconciled, and it means to become two again. Not one instead of the other, not one better than the other, not one on top of the other, not one in charge of the other, to become two again. And I've said very often publicly, I think the real two solitudes in Canada are not the French and English at all, but the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. We've had a 150-year-long experience of not knowing each other. And how do you reconcile with strangers? So when you ask the important question, what is the role for allies? First of all, who is an ally? And in the spirit of reconciled, it's everyone who is non-Indigenous who registers that we are all in this together going forward. So it means we have an obligation to be the government, to insist with those people that we elect that they do what it is we expect of them to do, and that we be well informed about that, and that we expect that there's equity in our country so that the distribution of resources is fair and equitable, and it's not as a historical issue, but as a present day issue, unfairly distributed, so that we are, in a legal way, feeding the haves and have-nots as if that's okay. That we feed our own outrage at things that are not acceptable in our country, and that we be the powerful voice, so it's not always Indigenous people having to point out the obvious of their own lives, that others speak up and own that as something that's not acceptable in our country. And I think that when I think about what allies therefore have to bring, I think there is a real need to bring humility about all those things that we do not know and have not known, where we need to set aside the notion that there is one answer, there's a correct answer, and that mainstream society has it, that we need to make room for the wisdom that is also in our midst from the Indigenous perspective and the much older worldview that's here in our midst. And I think we also have to, as allies, as ally community, I think we have to provide space. One of the things allies control very often in our country is space. And space can be valuable. It's a hugely valuable commodity, whether that is airwaves, whether that is physical space, whether that is the space that can be convened by resources that may exist with one group of people, so that the strangers can come together and become neighbors, and we can actually start to work together as if we knew each other and as if we actually cared about each other.
We have room for more questions. You don't have to ask 12 questions at once. One question is fine. They will answer them. Does anyone, I know the bar has been raised quite high from our first two, but just one question is fine. Does anyone have a single question that they'd like to ask our panelists?
I'll make a statement. I'm curious to hear comments. It's an honor to be here. My name's Evan Bray. I'm a farm kid from Abernethy, Saskatchewan, who just happens to now be with the Regina Police Service and the Chief of Police here. And it is an honor for me to be here. First of all, Sean, I'd like to thank you for the work you do. You know, it's important. Obviously, our role in the community is community safety, and knowing how important you see that, and we've formed a really good relationship between White Pony Lodge and our police service, working collaboratively, so thank you for that. And Chief Cadmus, I also want to thank you for, in fact, my comment is really based on a conversation that you and I have had a couple of times over the last year, but I just want to say one thing quickly is, just this year, we promoted a lady by the name of Audra Young to the rank of inspector. Audra is from Cowsas First Nation, and Audra is the first Indigenous inspector, which is a rank higher than a non-commissioned officer in our police services history. So I think that's pretty important. I called Cadmus to tell him that, and he mentioned, well, that's impressive. She's got two chiefs, a real one and you. Which I thought was kind of good. But I guess my point is, and I would like to hear the panel speak to this, because I really feel reconciliation is extremely important for our police service, but I really feel that it has nothing to do with the corporation and everything to do with the 603 men and women that work there. And again, I go back to a conversation, Cadmus kind of alluded to it tonight. that really I think it's an individual, it's how we as individuals, as human beings can work through this. Whether in my organization, whether it's an Aboriginal police member or a white police member, or it doesn't matter. Any of the diverse communities that make up our police service, it's really about individual truth, recognition of the truth, understanding of the truth, and a willingness to accept that, accept the responsibility, whether or not it was me, my ancestors or not. We all played a role in how we are today, and we will all play a role in moving forward. And I said earlier today at an event, you mentioned Reconciliation Regina. Again, I think it's less about a corporation and more about the individuals that are there to have the conversation. And I believe that our generation, those that are here tonight, those that are involved in this all across Canada, are doing the hard work. This is the hard work to get us forward. The vision is in future generations, we won't even have to have this conversation because we are living as two very distinct but cohabitating nicely, getting along, understanding the truth and moving forward. And I think that's an important part of it. So I'm just curious because when you talk about reconciliation, and I agree with the first speaker that sometimes it kind of becomes the buzzword, right? Well, we're going to do this, this, and this, and check it off the list in terms of reconciliation. But I really do believe it starts with individuals, and whether that is the leader of the organization, being able to bring all of the members together, because then for our police service, reconciliation is very easy. If 603 people understand the truth, are moving in the same direction, then as an organization, we have nowhere to go but in that direction as well. Thank you for being here. Thanks for having us.
Any comments? James?
I'll comment. Well, congratulations for doing that, Chief Bray. One thing I think is, and this also ties into Chastity's comment about corporations and institutions, is in order for the perception, and the perception is valid because it's happened for 140 years, often corporations, institutions, police forces have done things to people rather than with people. And so I guess from my perspective, working at the university, which is a pretty hermetically sealed universe, I'll admit, they've been working pretty hard to increase the attendance of Indigenous students. So there's a lead for indigenization, and they're actively recruiting Indigenous students. And I think the proportion of Indigenous students, not at First Nations, but at U of R, is close to 15%. Now, that's not reflective of what the percentage is of the population. It's probably more like 25%. But 10 years ago, it was only something like 8%. So I think, like with regard to the police force, but the civil service, you name it, institutions that have power, we need individuals with open minds, but also we need people to reflect the communities in which they work, be it SAS power, be it Crowns, be it police forces and stuff like that. And I think once we have a representative workforce, at a minimum, then there's going to be more of the idea of working with people rather than one institution being on top of a community.
Thank you, Evan. Definitely throws off Audra now with two chiefs. Let's start with truth. Strictly truth. The toughest to live in this province right now is First Nation women. Just to be a woman is tough. Inequality, but to be an Aboriginal woman, that just adds to it. That's truth. But that's the situation. Let's just not focus on the situation. What's our objective now to get past that? What's our strat plan to get past that? Who's our tactics team to make sure that's implemented? Who's our audience? Sometimes when we talk truth, we focus on the situation so much that we get fatigued. And we just, okay, that conversation's done. Some people say, I did my part, I identified the situation. That's where we have to have not just a focus on the situation. Once you feel your conversation has identified the situation, be that leader in the circle and say, okay, what's our objective? How are we going to address this? Are we going to start some panels? Are we going to start having conversations? Are we going to make sure that everybody in this organization has that right to move up regardless gender, regardless of race? That's truth. The next truth is you walk into our jail in Regina You walk into the Paul Dojak Center, I volunteer at both, 95% Indigenous people in both. Truth, Correctional Center, one of the inmates told me, this is just a residential school reunion. That's truth. But that's the situation. Let's not just sit on the situation. What's our objective? I go there and I ask them, what do you need? What is it that you need to get out of here? And this is what one of them told me. In here, I need faith. I need belief because that wasn't taught to me in my home fire. Okay? We have sweat lodges. We got a ceremonial person. The moment they go to the halfway house, absolutely nothing but mentorship to get a job. They end up back in the correctional center. That's what I mean. We identify the situation, but what's the objective? Those are truths. But when Chief Evan talks about what role we play is reconciliation, to separate it now to reconciliation, those are calls to action. There's 94 of them, and you got to have some uncomfortable conversations. Number 45, Doctrine of Discovery. There was a game in 1460 in Europe. If people don't pray the way we do, don't have fences around their houses, or don't grow gardens the way we do, they're uncivilized people and you can conquer them. That is why the Queen figures she has sovereignty on this land, because we were uncivilized people. That's the way we were viewed. When Christopher Columbus's flag hit the New Americas in 1492, all the underlying title was gone from my ancestors. Today, Cowes' land in and around Regina, it's worth next to nothing because of the Indian Act. That's some of the things that Doctrine of Discovery has to address. What if it ever happened tomorrow that they canceled Doctrine of Discovery and all of a sudden all this land reverts back to the original inhabitants of Indigenous people? What does that mean? Does that mean that everybody's house has to be renegotiated? Does that mean the Bank Act in this country has to be rediscovered? It's a very, very uncomfortable thing to think about. But that's truth. That's reconciliation and truth. That kind of speaks to, we have to talk about that stuff. Like, those are realities. So just a couple comments.
Can we get more people at our mic while we're getting our panelists talking? We have one more brave individual.
Did I take your time? No, okay.
And your name.
My name is Darren Milo. I want to thank all of you for coming out and sharing with us. I'm a trade unionist, Canadian Office of Professional Employees, Local 397. If you had an opportunity to have the labor leaders of Saskatchewan representing 100,000 workers in this province, unionized workers, and what would you say to them? What kind of conversations would you have with them about how we can get reconciliation from their, on a meaningful level and an effective level in educating the membership, educating people at large, and in getting involved in directly with actions in helping to bring forward reconciliation?
Marie?
Well, I would say one of the things, because what your union represents in a collective bottom line kind of way is employment and jobs. And when we talked before about the measures and the gap and so on, one of the areas of huge gap is on the level of, let's just say the word poverty, where the numbers of people who are living in economic hardship is so disproportionately high among the Indigenous population right across the country, in every region. And so if you trace that back and people talk about hard to get a job because I didn't really get a good education, because how could I learn when I was so stressed all of the time, and how that plays itself forward. And then the number of people who then have the further trauma of having children removed from their homes, very often for a reason that's given, which is neglect, but very often it's actually poverty, which is translated as neglect. So you end up with a kind of vicious cycle where then people are heartbroken and ripped apart because of the loss of their children. And so many people told us, of the 7,000 who spoke to us, very, very, very high percentage spoke to us about self-medicating in drugs and or alcohol because they had nothing else at hand for taking care of their devastation, basically. So to come back, and I would say not just to the union community, but to the corporate sector as well, and to the professional associations, job creation and job opportunity is a huge practical issue. And I was a long-time employer before I ever became a TRC commissioner, had the opportunity to hire a lot of people. And one of the clauses in any job description that I zeroed in on, and I took as liberal an interpretation of that as I could, because I was determined to hire Indigenous people, was the clause that said, or other related relevant experiences. And I can't think of a person who's functioning in a community who isn't multi-skilled on a whole lot of levels, starting with problem solving, conflict resolution, survival skills, creative solutions, and so on and so on. I think you have an opportunity in any workplace to find good people, to take a chance, to create mentorships where you can, and to allow people to grow in and develop the incredible skills, many of them proven skills that are already there, and that's particularly so in the trades. You know, I come from the Northwest Territories, and I tell you, if you're ever to go out at 45 below into the bush, you want to go with somebody who's a traditional trapper, or someone who may not have even a high school diploma, but they're sure going to be the one saving your life because they know how to problem solve and be creative in a whole lot of really actually hard technical skill areas. So I think we have to be very generous in how we look at things and create intentionally opportunities to bring people in if we want to change workforces and if we want to redefine. And if I may just offer a PS on that point, because it has to do with your earlier question, Chief, about the individuals within an institution. But I think we all know that institutions themselves, beyond the institutions, can have their own culture. And sometimes you can have people come in and next thing you know, they're sucked right into the culture of the place for the good or the bad of it. So I think the leadership that you're showing and that other leaders have to show is to say, yes, we'll do these things with individuals, but we will also set new intentions for the organization itself, for how we want it to be. I think that's really important.
I feel if I stare at you uncomfortably, somebody will offer up a sacrifice of a question. So we have 20 minutes left, so we've got to be brave. Oh, here we go.
I wasn't invited, but I crashed the place anyway. I'm a former union executive officer as well, and I wonder what you do to support the people who are working, because we get service aides, they train, they get hired, and the attendance record is horrible. They lose their job in less time than it took them to train for it. And it really made me mad. We worked so hard to get these people working, and then all of a sudden they go back to the reserve. The reserve seems to say, well, you don't have to go back to work. They'll take you whenever you want to come back. And it was so frustrating. They're the best workers on the job when they're there, but they're hardly ever there. And I see the support in the workplace, but I don't see the support back in their culture. Mm-hmm. I may be totally off base, but what can you tell me about that question?
Cadmus.
Thank you. I don't know if I ever show it, but when I was 19 years old, I wanted to live on the reserve my entire life, shack up in my parents' basement. And anytime I left the reserve, I just couldn't wait to go back because I was so uncomfortable past the reserve line. And it's called identity and where your view of you belong. And there's a lot of people like that out there. It was my parents that nudged me and said, "You're not shacking up in our basement." So I moved to Regina. I failed and fell over and failed and fell over. And people around me kept picking me up and dusting me off till I finally got it. And then I started to excel and succeed. There's many people out there that are going to a trip that are going to fall. And if we don't pick them up and dust them off, then they're not going to come back. And that's just the reality of some of the challenges that we deal with. I just want to combine your two questions. What I love about unions and many different things is your sense of belonging. That you look to your left and right, you got your soldiers, you got your BFFs, you got your support mechanism, and you feel that you're protected. That's a tribal thing. That's not just a union thing. Traditionally, everybody had a role in the tribe. Everybody had a place to be, right from morning to dark. There was no unemployment. Everybody had a role, but that support was there. Unions, you're the same way. Like, you just have this tribal feeling to you. And some of our nations have to rediscover stuff like that. But now to just wrap it up is how do we get past that? Is everybody's on their own journey right now. We can't just judge the next person that shows up to work with the last person that showed up to work and didn't come. Everybody has a story to tell. And they need to look someone in the eyes in that workplace and feel wanted and feel needed and feel that they're respected. And sometimes we get so consumed in work that we don't look each other in the eyes anymore because we're too busy on Facebook, too busy on our phones. And all of a sudden we look up and we're like, where's Cadmus? Well, he quit last week. Oh, okay. And you get back up. Like we have to, understand their journey and really, really get to know them. Because once that relationship is built, you're going to be amazed at how productive and successful a lot of them are. And it's a whole other conversation that I can have about it. I don't want to spend the remainder of our time. It's something that's very passionate about what I do now today. But everybody has their own journey, and just don't judge them. Get to know their journey, and you'd be amazed at how beautiful of a character that is. So I just leave it there.
James?
Yeah, this will be a lot less eloquent than Cadmus's answer. I've been teaching at U of R for probably 18 years. And one of my first jobs, it was so long ago, was Indian Studies at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College. And so as a university teacher, I was like, okay, and getting ready. And one of my neighbor was one of the advisors at SIFC, Kathleen Robinson. And she said, oh, Jim, you should take attendance. And I was like, these guys are in university. I'm not taking attendance. I'm not the man. And she said, no, it's not for truancy. It's because the students are 1 and 2 spaces away from some kind of trauma. Okay, so like you keep an eye on somebody doesn't come to class for a couple weeks, maybe you want to find out what's going on. And so actually someone in that course, it was someone more my age than younger students' age, didn't come to class for a while, and I spoke to Kathleen about it, and she tracked him down. He was in the hospital with some very serious heart condition, and she managed to work out the paperwork before the person was kicked out of school and wouldn't be allowed back. So I was just telling you that I'm very proud that U of R is increasing the Indigenous participation. But I had a student at the beginning of the term last fall, first-year student, who informed me like a couple weeks into school that her mom had died. So she had to go to, there was trauma in her family, she had to go to the funeral. And later on in the term, her brother had died. She stayed in that course and actually passed the course. So, from a teacher perspective, maybe as an employer perspective, you want to think about it that way. There's so much trauma in some families that you have to figure out a way to maneuver that, because the student was more than able and just overcoming those obstacles.
Shauna?
Yes, I'd like to speak to that as well. I guess in regards to the question and, just speaking of my own personal journey, I never realized that maybe I can make the impact that I do today on my community. I was basically written off at birth, just being born an Indigenous girl. I had so much struggles. I struggled at a very early age, especially in school because of the violence within my home. I was unable to concentrate. I was unable to connect with the work. There's PSTD. You know, I have a very close member of my family who has PSTD. His mother is a 60 scoop survivor who, and he became very disconnected to his culture, to his identity. He got caught up in the gang lifestyle, got caught up into alcohol, drugs. But he is working today to try and better his life. Today he's revered as and maybe appearance-wise as a gang member. And he's doing his best to come back from that, to understand what is the history, what is causing all of this for me. So he has a huge journey to undergo, but I think there needs to be more awareness in regards to what is intergenerational trauma? What does that look like? What are the effects, right? As I said, personally, I was written off, and that's how I feel. Today, I have to fight continuously to prove and show who I am, because I don't have that degree. But I have a lot of Indigenous knowledge that my grandfather, that my grandparents have taught me when I was a little girl. And that doesn't necessarily always resonate with the non-Indigenous community. I just got to say that, I'm very grateful and thankful for the opportunities that I have, and I take that as a huge responsibility, because I'm forming a way for others to follow behind me. So with that, I just want to say that, don't give up on those people who are genuinely trying to move forward in their lives and to connect to who they are as well.
Thank you, Shauna. Do you have a question? That was great. And your name, please.
My name's Joey Reynolds. I'm from the Musakahikan First Nation from northern Manitoba, which is 64 miles southeast of DePaul, Manitoba. 64 miles southeast of the Pasquiak Cree Nation of DePaul, Manitoba. I just thought about something that was very special in my heart. I'm speaking from my heart, not from my mind. I was related to a man called the late Joey Ross. Joey Ross passed away about 1980, 81, when I was about 11 years old. My mom did like a lot of sewing. She worked for him. She was employed by him for beading and knitting at the time. And I remember one of the special things in my heart, that the late Joey Ross, Chief Joey Ross, we got a Joey Ross school up in DePaul now on the Pasquiak Cree Nation. But I remember Joey Ross said one time that really hit my heart. He says he looked at town of DePaul on the First Nation side, and DePaul used to be at one time was First Nation land at one time. But according to historians in Manitoba, we were put on the other side. Pasquiak First Nation was put on the other side, and the town of DePaul took the good land. And it just I don't know, it's just something that I heard, according from an Anglican priest in DePaul. And this is a start for reconciliation. It's a long way to go, eh? And Joey Ross once said one time he said, I can see the town of DePaul, but can the peoples from the town of DePaul see me? Or can they see us looking at them? But will they want to see us and look back? Question. That's for reconciliation, eh? I'm related to my uncle, I'm related to Helen Betty Osborne. That could have been my auntie. Everybody knows the Helen Betty Osborne story. And my uncle Cornelius, that was his girlfriend. And I'm from a town in DePaul that had like a lot of trauma. And I come from a family from the residential school. I'm a 60 scoop child from a reserve called Pugatawagan, Manitoba, and I was adopted to another reserve. And I understand trauma. I don't know if I do. I really don't. I can talk about it, but I got a long way to go for reconciliation. I'm trying to get some counseling for my alcoholism, my drug problem, and I got a grade 12. I'm happy I got a grade 12, but I know I can go further with that. I pray to Kitchimanatu, I pray to the Creator that things will go well, eh? But it's a tough schedule. It's a tough road, Chief, eh? And it's something that I just wanted to say that day. Just wanted to leave that little quote with that late Joy Ross. And also, too, I thought about something that bothered me. Something was on the radio station that basically, somebody said on the radio station, you know, he didn't like being called a colonialist. And he didn't like being called a colonialist, didn't like being called a settler. He wanted to be called a son of an immigrant, eh? And I'm confused with that, eh? You know, and according to what I heard on the radio, eh? So do we start from reconciliation with that for people to understand if they're colonialists or are they settlers, and are they comfortable with that word? Or do you want to be called son of an immigrant? That a lot of people are mad being called a colonialist and a settler. Well, we got to start off somewhere to be called comfortable with those words, because those words are, some people find that insulting, eh? I just wanted to say thank you very much, Wash Day, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your comment. Did you have a comment as well?
That's okay. To be expected, I'm back. So I we'll end off with a simple question, but I blame my inquisitiveness on Jim because he was a great professor, and after taking his courses, everything was questioned. And I remember a while back, I was researching some papers, and I was trying to draw a parallel. This was 4 years ago now, a parallel between residential school and the foster care system. And it wasn't quite talked about as much, but he encouraged me to keep questioning that. And now it's one of our conversations that we have regularly in our communities, drawing those parallels. And I had a non-Indigenous friend who was very offended by that comment, by my drawing those parallels. And so we brought him in. We brought him in to share. But anyway, so I'm grateful. He's part of the reason why I'm here doing this kind of work. I also just wanted to share something positive. I currently work for the Catholic School Board. I'm the Aboriginal advocate in my high school. And in going back to Shauna's comments about struggling through school, it hasn't stopped yet. We have a large number of students still in our school who have to get through these barriers, these educational barriers, and a lot of our teachers don't understand the dynamics of our students and the historical trauma that they come from, because it's still happening. But on a positive note, we have 2 Aboriginal advocates in our school here in the school that I work at specifically, who work directly with those students that we've never had in high school, and that our parents didn't have. So there is positive steps to reconciliation, and those actionable items are so important, and I just want to acknowledge that actionable item. So now my question, a lot more simple question, is so for maybe this can come from each and every one of you, for the average First Nation person in our communities, what kind of advice can you give them as far as reconciliation and how they could promote it or encourage it or acknowledge it? Thank you.
So we have just 5. Of course, now everyone gets very excitable when we only have 5 minutes left. You had a question?
If there's time.
So you ask your question, then I'm going to give each of the panelists about a minute each to answer. How's that? Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. My name is Blair Roberts. I've lived in Regina for about 15 years now. I can't quit thinking about Colton Boushie and Tina Fontaine. I know they're but they're the latest in a long list of names that have lost their lives. And I guess part of the reason I'm here tonight, this whole question, is reconciliation possible? How? Maybe that's, I know you guys have been talking about it all night, but as a white individual, I don't know how that forgiveness could be there. The conversation feels so toxic right now. I know like even CBC has closed down a lot of the comment sections on the Indigenous stories because of the racism. And so you mentioned Colton Boushie, and suddenly everybody feels like they can come out of the woodwork. It's almost like people have permission to be racist now, or they don't think they're being racist. But anyway, to wrap it up, I guess my question to you guys would just be, in the midst of this, I know tension isn't always a bad thing, right? Maybe this tension can lead us somewhere healthy, but what if you could point maybe to something that gives you hope in the midst of what feels to me like a really heavy, dark time? So.
Thank you so much for that. Each one of our panelists gets 1 minute each to answer that question. Marie, we'll start with you.
Well, my comments wouldn't be so specific just to Saskatchewan, but I do believe I agree with what the last speaker said, that I try to be a very positive person, and I can assure you that I would not have survived hearing the statements that we heard from 7,000 people, that I would not have been able to bear that without being able to see the positive that was in what was said to us in terms of what people had managed to do with their own lives and what they were willing to share with the rest of the country. So I think that we are forced, in a way, to confront things when they are real people with real names, with real pictures of real lives and real devastation that is in our midst. It's not a theoretical issue. It's not a dusty historical issue. It's a right now issue in our midst. And that sharpens our attention, and that's a good thing. As long as we don't think reconciliation is an exercise in hand-wringing or an exercise in twiddling our thumbs. It is reconciliation. And for each of us not to fret endlessly about what can be done and what can I do, but rather to say, what am I doing? And if the answer is I am either not doing anything differently than I ever did before, or I'm not doing anything new that is something that I did not do before, then we are not challenging ourselves enough. I think each of us should be asking ourselves those questions. And I think we should be also convening new circles of people. So if it's the same people talking to the same people in the future, we shouldn't expect big new answers to be unfolding. But if we are consciously and intentionally inviting new people to our conversations so that we're being provoked to think about things in new ways and to benefit from the perspectives of others that we may not have known before, then all kinds of new possibilities open themselves up. And so I think we just keep trying on that front. We hold our politicians to account because one of the things they hold is resources that can make a huge difference in all kinds of fronts, and that needs to be redistributed and shared in a more fair way. And I think all of us, make sure that we are loving our children to the maximum, because we have inherited a whole generation of children who've grown up thinking that no one loved them and that no one cared about them. And some of them, by their own repeated admission, have therefore not known how to express that to their children. And it is a devastation that can be ruinous to lives, and we need to stop that. We need to recognize the children in our midst as all of our children and to love them as we would any of our own children. And that is our shared and sacred responsibility, in my opinion.
Thank you. Shauna?
I'm sorry, the question one more time?
How can we repair Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships?
I think, first of all, I think it's first understanding that reconciliation begins with yourself. It begins with you forming an understanding on what reconciliation may look like with the other individuals' feelings and other person's feelings as well. And, I'm sorry about that. But I feel it's like, being responsible, but also taking ownership. And I think that needs to come from both sides, both non-Indigenous and the Indigenous community. And I feel like when it comes to reconciliation and coming together and rebuilding again, I think we need to understand that, first of all, a lot of times we kind of hook forgiveness onto that. And reconciliation doesn't necessarily say we need to forgive, right? But reconciliation says, let's build a new relationship. You know, to me, that's what reconciliation looks like, and built on, you know, trust and like trust and understanding each other. So not necessarily, you know, do we necessarily need to forgive, because sometimes it's really tough to forgive, and there has been a lot of trust that was broken down, you know, within our communities, within our relationships, and sometimes it's a tough place. But at the same time, we need to understand that reconciliation doesn't necessarily always mean forgiving. It just means building a new relationship.
Thank you so much, Shauna. James?
Thanks. I guess just building on Shauna's point about individuals and family. I'm not sure if you folks are familiar with a book from a couple years ago called The Education of Augie Morasti. Right? I'm seeing a lot of heads kind of nodding. Well, it was a residential school memoir written by a man who'd survived, but he was really damaged. And so over the course of probably a decade, maybe 15 years, he worked with an English professor to write a manuscript. And really, like, he told people, you know, like, sometimes he was homeless in Prince Albert, sometimes he'd disappear for a while, but he's telling people, I'm writing a book. And people, like, kind of blew him off. He's riding the bus all day, like, yeah, right, we'll see it when I believe. Actually, that's what happened to me for a while, but that's another story. Anyhow, when Augie's book finally came out, it was before he passed away, and he actually had the proof. And he brought that book to his family. And I think it was his daughter said, this ends here. Because, excuse me, Augie owned his story. He took it back. And so that's where things are going to change, like, you know, in individual families. And I think, Chastity, talking about, you know, what do we tell the school kids? I was up at Little Pine First Nation a few years ago, speaking to the grade 7s, and Chief Little Pine was actually starved into going to his community. And that was a terrible message to give the grade 7s. And I said, look, I know you guys are mad, but don't break a window. Go to law school. Like, that's where you can make the change. So, and I guess to address your point, yeah, like, it's, you know, we've all, well, probably all of us in this room are hope, you know, like, are looking out and thinking maybe, you know, oh, maybe reconciliation is a mirage after the verdict in the Stanley trial. But maybe what it is it just puts into sharp focus how much work we all as citizens have to do. Like, this is going to be a long road to hoe, for sure.
Cadmus.
Thank you. Try answer a lot of it. I got 1 minute. I know I got 1 minute.
I took 1 minute.
Somebody asked me one time, so how is it being Indigenous, ... I'm like, well, I don't know how it is to be non-Indigenous, so I don't know how to answer that question. You know, being a golfer, I'm just going to end with this. I entered a field where there was no Indigenous people around me. And I felt I had to constantly prove myself and prove myself and prove myself. And every time I tried to give up telling my mom and dad, I don't want to prove myself anymore. I just want to stay home. I'm the only Indian there. I don't want to be a part of it. I don't feel included. And my dad just would sit me down and he says, don't you ever stop improving yourself to people. Because right now you're going to bust through barriers that the next one coming behind you, it's going to be easier. And you have to do that. So I kept busting through these barriers of golf till I got to the top. And I didn't look back. I just started winning and winning and winning and winning. It wasn't the trophies that I was winning. It was the fact that there was a guy that was a First Nation that was winning in a competition where First Nations people don't win. And now today when I look back, I see about 10 First Nation kids doing that. You know, and Chastity's question and my brother who got up and shared a little bit about his challenges is, if you feel that you're just tired of proving yourself, look at that little kid that you're going to fist pound with. And Chastity says, what do you tell him? You ask him, who are you chasing? You're chasing yourself in 10 years. Don't compare yourself to a rapper. Don't compare yourself to a movie star. Chase yourself in 10 years. Who do you look up to? Look up, have faith. Everybody needs faith. Look up to something. And you know, and who do you get excited to see? It's your family when you get home at the end of the day. So just in conclusion, you know, this is a really, really good, I have so much more to say, but I just want to end it off by saying, you know, it takes all of us, and I was really excited to share, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
And I want to say to Chief Cadmus that I want to move, because if everyone gets to be good looking in your community, then... No, but I actually do want to pick up on that little kid. I want to tell you a really fast little story about my granddaughter, who's Dena in the Northwest Territories. And we were at a gathering a couple of months ago now. She was with a group of little kids dancing. The teacher was away, and this replacement said, to get to know the kids, I want you all to tell me your favorite color, and I want you to tell me your favorite animal. So they went around the circle. The colors were mostly pink. They were little girls. And then the animals. And I heard my granddaughter say, my favorite animal is a unicorn. So we're driving home, and she's 9, and I say, Sadea, you do know that unicorns are not real animals, right? And she looked at me like I was some kind of idiot, and she said, Mimi, of course I do, she said. But I like to believe in my own imagination. And I love that story, because that's what we're being asked to do, I think, as a community, as communities, and as a country, is to believe in our own imagination of those things that we have not yet seen, that may seem unrealistic just because they've never been real in our reality, and to believe they're possible because we choose to believe in them.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the CBC and on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists for coming out and sharing so deeply with us today.
Who wants to shake hands?
There were a lot of people involved in making tonight's event possible. I'd like to thank our administrative, social media, and communication staff, as well as our managers. We've also had many staff volunteers. You can see them. They're all wearing the T-shirts with I Love CBC on them. I'd like to thank them. The biggest thank, of course, goes to our technical team for the work they've done to broadcast, record, light, and provide audio here, and for the people watching online. And I was told not to mention her name, but I have to say Sharon, who's hiding behind the screen, was instrumental in contacting each of the panelists and getting them to come out. And I wanted to thank Sharon for her hard work. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us today. We are, I know we have to go because we have issues with locking up and security, but if, you know, we have a few minutes to just mingle and talk to our panelists, and then I believe we're about to be kicked out. Thank you so much for coming today.
Sitting here in the moonlight, stars shine in your eyes. We could sit here till daylight